Whelan?
said that it was illegal for settlers to cross the Appalachian Mountains. Now, the proclamation line of 1763 was something that lots of people in colonial America, particularly Virginians, resented. Because Virginians were always pushing west. Now, the reason that Virginians were always pushing west is that they grew tobacco. Why would pushing westward and growing tobacco be connected? We never really talked about this in class, but does anybody know? Go ahead, do it, Justice.
Tobacco tire out the land so that they
Right. Tobacco tires the soil. And because it tires out the soil, tobacco growers are always looking for more land. So it's not surprising that the Virginians would move into western Pennsylvania. Remember, it was the Virginians that claimed it, right? It was the Virginians, Washington, that sort of fought for it. And then when they were excluded from it by the proclamation, it was the Virginians like Washington and others that were resentful of it. So in New England, they were resentful of Britain attempting to regulate their commerce and trade with the writs of assistance. In Virginia, they were resentful because the British were trying to prevent them from expanding. Now, both of those things represent actions that Britain hadn't previously taken. I mean, prior to the French and Indian War, the British, salutary neglect. Now, in attempting to sort of bring the empire under control, they are taking actions. And Americans who had been ignored for over 100 years are starting to see those actions as dangerous and, in many cases, violations of their rights. Now, beyond those actions, and we said maybe more significant, Britain attempts to generate revenue from colonial America. Now, does anybody remember the name of, except besides the instructor, that remember the name of the Prime Minister who is kind of orchestrating this in 1763 and 1764? Anyone besides the instructor. He is going to be responsible for the Sugar Act, the Currency Act. Not Townsend yet. Go ahead, dear Nicole. Grenville. He is responsible for the Sugar Act of 1764, the Currency Act of 1764, the Quartering Act of 1765, right? Which were also efforts by the British to tighten up colonial control and to generate revenue. Now, Currency, Quartering, and Sugar Act. Currency, Quartering, and Sugar Act. With the Quartering Act, just for fun, right, just to remind you, with the Quartering Act, what Britain wanted to do is have British soldiers permanently stationed in colonial North America. And not only that, not only did they want soldiers to be stationed there, they wanted the colonists to contribute to paying for them, which ordinarily you wouldn't think would be such a big deal. And the British thought that it wasn't such a big deal, but the Americans resented it on a number of different levels. They resented having to pay for it, and they also were suspicious that an army would be used against them. Colonial people, unlike people today, were really, really nervous of a standing army. And one thing I'd like to point out about this sort of anxiety about a standing army, the anxiety about a standing army that's there in colonial America doesn't go away until after World War II for Americans. America fights a war in the Revolution, and it builds an army, and then it lets it go. And then it fights another war in the French and Indian, or not the French and Indian War, the War of 1812, and it builds an army, and then it lets it go. And then it fights the Mexican War, it builds an army, and it lets it go. Then it fights the Civil War, it builds an army, and lets it go. Then it fights the Spanish-American War, builds an army, and lets it go. Then it even fights World War I, builds an army, and lets it go. Right? It's only until after World War II that America builds an army and maintains it. Right? Maintains a strong, powerful military, Army, Navy, Air Force, etc. It's only after World War II that they do that, and that's largely because after World War II, there is this fear of an immediate threat to our safety and security, that being the Soviet Union and the Cold War. prior to that time, Americans were pretty much convinced that they would be shielded by the oceans. I mean, even up to World War I, we are convinced that we are going to be protected from, sort of invasion by the oceans. And so it's not until the Soviets detonate nuclear weapons, and you have airplanes, and you have other things where our safety and security is more far-reaching, that America thinks that it must maintain a standing army. Right? Isn't that a good connection of ways? That's a good connection, isn't it? Well, anyways, the most significant legislation that is passed by Grenville is the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act is a game changer. The Stamp Act is a game changer because the stated purpose of the Stamp Act is to generate revenue for England. Now, many Americans argued, almost all Americans argued, that that was a violation of Americans' natural rights. Does anybody remember how specifically that argument is made? The Stamp Act, and I'll tell you what the Stamp Act is, and you tell me why they said it was a violation of their natural rights. The Stamp Act was legislation that created stamps that had to be affixed to all kind of paper documents. And so in order to have a paper document, you had to pay for the stamp. The stamp was, in essence, a tax. It was a means of generating revenue. The revenue that was going to be generated was going to go to the Crown, to England. Now, the British promised that they would use that revenue to pay for things in America. But the colonists said, you can't do this. This is a violation of our natural rights. Jason H.U. will explain to the cyber audience how that is a violation of colonial natural rights. Go ahead, dear Jason H.U.
It's taxation without representation.
Oh, what he said is taxation without representation. Taxation without representation is tyranny. Taxation without representation is theft. Does anyone besides Ellen and myself remember who actually coined that phrase? Taxation without representation. Go ahead, Conan.
John Locke.
It was not John Locke. Taxation, Melissa, do you remember? Is anyone besides Ellen and myself? You do not remember.
That's what I was thinking.
Not Adams either.
Is it Patrick Henry?
Not Patrick Henry. James Otis. James Otis coined that term, that phrase. Taxation without representation is tyranny. Now, Kunal, listen to the argument, right? Okay. The argument went this way. The fundamental natural rights that human beings possess, a la John Locke, are life, liberty, and property. Your money is your property. If somebody takes your property without your consent, they're stealing it, correct? So if somebody takes your property without your consent, they rob you of your property without your consent, that's theft. If you are taxed by government without your consent, then government is robbing you. Well, then the question is raised, how does one consent to be taxed? What the American colonists said is one consents to be taxed by electing people to the taxing body. So if I get to vote for the people who tax me, by virtue of voting for them, I am consenting for them to tax me. Therefore, colonial Americans said, look, our local assemblies can tax us. Sure, they can tax us, because we vote for those representatives. That's with our consent. But Parliament, in which we have no representation, can't tax us. Hence, taxation without representation is theft. Does anybody know what the British response to that argument was? Yes, good.
They said that the members of Parliament represented the people.
I'm so happy that you answered that question. They call that virtual representation. That the members of Parliament represented everyone in the empire, regardless of whether they were elected by them. Now, I think I said this at the time, the British are not going to give up on virtual representation until deep into the Revolutionary War. The Americans are not going to give up on taxation without representation is theft. And so what resolves the debate is the revolution. Now, in terms of the Stamp Act, the argument against the Stamp Act is taxation without representation is theft. And what we said was this: colonial Americans responded and protested the Stamp Act in 3 ways. One was a series of resolutions